Dr. Perry's lecture asserts that the medium is the message by exploring Marshall McLuhan's understanding and definition of the topic. Dr. Perry provided the interesting example of the point in time that people went from not having an MP3 player to having an MP3 player. Prior to this point, people were more connected to those around them. After the advent of the MP3 player and its successful integration into everyday life, the more that people used this, they themselves acted a bit different. The technology enabled people to become more individualistic and isolated from those around them. The technology allowed for them to enter a kind of bubble that separated them from everyone else. Human interaction was changed. No matter what people were listening to and for how long, the technology was having a similar effect on everyone. In this way, the medium was the message as it created a changed pattern of what was commonplace, and through that technology, the changes became apparent in everyday life and interactions. This correlates to the idea of the medium being message quite well in Chapter 20 of Understanding Media. In this chapter, the discussion of the photograph establishes an understanding that the photograph, too, was a medium becoming the message. Prior to the utilization of photograph, anything comparable was a bit different. For example, paintings conformed to the different kind of message because of the ways and means in which they were created. Their message could be decided, and the color palette, images, and symbols all laid out by the painter. A photograph was something new. It contained a lot of the things a painting can, but in different ways. McLuhan establishes that paintings represent a form of hot media, since the image is the image. That is what is impressed upon the audience, and it remains with little involvement from the person viewing. It may be argued that photographs represent a hotter media, as they stand alone as autonomous snippets of life. They encapsulate a moment in real time, and there the moment remains forever, its details as fresh as the moment eyes first observed them. McLuhan's text goes on to declare that syntax was one of the vital components that existed quite clearly in the print world that no longer played as key of a role when it came to the photograph. Syntax gave measurement to the physical components that gave definition to the images of the past. The picture technology of photography is what gave the photograph power alone to give autonomous representation to the world within it. These still frames gave a glimpse into the reality of life as it became trapped within its borders and existed as a bleeding slice of life in the truest of ways. The text associates this level of power and importance with the gestalt that photographs brought to the table. The photograph represents an organized whole that is ultimately perceived as being more than the sum of its individual components. What is meant was the images in photographs made up something that the audience took in as more than just an image. This is a clear example of the medium being the message. Not all in there is good. We can see in the text that certain alarms sound when McLuhan explains, however, to say that the camera cannot lie is merely to underline the multiple deceits that are now practiced in its name. Photos are used in some ways to appeal to or sway public opinion, just as sensational or dramatic news stories had once done without photography. Photographs still carry the potential of being taken out of context or without further details and elaboration, misunderstood completely. Sometimes this may occur by accident, and at times on purpose. Ultimately, the photograph would go on to challenge those who had used imagery in the past to describe and visualize the world around them. The text exclaims that perhaps the greatest revolution produced by photograph was in the traditional arts. The painter could no longer depict a world that had been much photographed. He turned instead to reveal the inner process of creativity and expressionism and in abstract art. Likewise, the novelist could no longer describe objects or happenings for readers who already knew what was happening by photo, press, film, and radio. The poet and novelist turn to those inward gestures of the mind by which we achieve insight and by which we make ourselves and our world. Over time, technology has gradually advanced. It may, however, also have detrimental social repercussions. The media frequently introduces into our personal lives and disrupts social order. Not always because they're required or even desired. People want new technologies simply because they're available. Technology is a strong human extension that has the potential to arouse excitement or apathy. Any form of technology is a sensory experience that can alter somebody's bodily and emotional consciousness. People are becoming more fractured because of technology, which makes them more vulnerable to shifts in their physical and mental states. People must be aware of how media influences them for them to understand the type of influence technological advances have on both them and other people. To truly understand the medium of photograph, it becomes imperative that we learn as much about the other forms and mediums that came before and after, and how the photograph relates to them all. Shared components exist, though the photograph makes a special place for itself in the world of communications. In Chapter 21, McLuhan asserts the breaking of old, traditional ways of doing the news by usage of new technologies to gauge public opinion faster than ever before. The test examines the use of electrical technologies as a way of getting to faster points of decision-making than ever before, as the former written forms of technology and communication would inherently lead to longer, natural pauses that required time and collaboration before opinions formed and decisions were made. Newer forms of technology and communication would share information at breakneck speed and offer people the chance to make their thoughts known almost immediately as they became larger stakeholders in the conversation. This would be greatly evident in the informational sharing process of the time. Immediately in the chapter, the text uses President John Kennedy as an example of doing just this. Another example we can remember was the US-backed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion was the failed attempt by US-backed Cuban exiles to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. President Eisenhower authorized the operation, and it was subsequently approved by President Kennedy. On April 17, 1961, a 1,400-man invasion force of anti-Castro Cuban exiles, Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs beach on the south coast of Cuba. Quickly overwhelmed by a counterattack of Castro's armed forces, the invasion force was crushed 2 days later. More than 100 men were killed, and nearly 1,100 were taken prisoner and held in Cuba for nearly 2 years. Instead of toppling the Castro regime, the invasion strengthened Castro's image with the Cuban people, solidified his alignment with the Soviet Union, and emboldened Premier Khrushchev in his belief that Kennedy was weak and inexperienced. Overall, it appeared that President Kennedy was soft on communism. Publicly, President Kennedy took responsibility for the invasion's failure. "We intend to profit from this lesson," he said at his address to the American Society of Newspaper Editors on April 20th. In a news conference the following day, he noted, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I'm the responsible officer of the government." Gallup polls taken the following week showed Kennedy had an 83% approval rating, and 61% of Americans approved of his handling of the invasion. Given the nature of the electronic age, McLuhan's assertions about the importance of technology when it came to things like government leadership through the press, we can clearly see through these examples that leaders such as Kennedy were changing the name of the game when it came to being upfront when it mattered, because of the clear understanding of how quickly things could go south with bad press and bad public opinion, when stories go public in the blink of an eye. With this strategy in mind, using that speed and technology in his favor, this example represents how technology and media could be used to shape public opinion in a positive light in the darkest of situations. Overall, McLuhan's chapters give light to the advent of technologies and faster processes when it comes to communications and how messages are communicated. The medium becomes the message, and with each turn, more and more people play their part.